Okay, so today we're diving into blockchain. And wow, you've really brought us some interesting material. It looks like we've got kind of two sides to this story, right? So instead of just like explain what blockchain is, I think what we should do is actually have a debate using the stuff you gave us. Like really get into the arguments for and against it so we can, see both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like you've given us the case for blockchain, calling it, this transformative force for good, right? And then on the other hand, you've got the case against blockchain, which is calling it a flawed promise. And these are like really strong opinions, and they're not just about the tech stuff. They're about morals and the economy and all kinds of things. It's pretty fascinating.
Sure. It's like, is this going to save the world or is it going to, ruin everything?
Exactly. So let's jump into it, shall we?
Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so let's start with the opening argument, right? That the people who are pro-blockchain, the ones who think it's going to change everything for the better, what are their main points?
Well, I mean, they start off pretty strong. They talk about how this is going to be huge, like everyone's going to be using it. They even quote the World Economic Forum saying that by 2030, 10% of all the data about global GDP is going to be on blockchain.
Wow, 10%. That's a lot.
Yeah, it's not messing around. They're saying this is going to be everywhere, basically. And then they bring up this study from MIT. It says that because blockchain is decentralized, it can actually make supply chains way more secure. They could cut fraud by, get this, up to 30%.
30%. I mean, that's got to get businesses' attention for sure.
Oh, yeah, definitely. But it goes beyond just business, The pro-blockchain folks, they make a big deal about the ethical side of things, too.
Right. Right, because if it can stop people from getting ripped off,
yeah,
that's a good thing, right?
Exactly. So they talk a lot about financial inclusion, like giving people access to money and financial systems, even if they don't have a bank account. The World Bank, they say there are 1.7 billion people worldwide without access to banking. That's a huge number of people.
Yeah, absolutely. And blockchain could help them, they're saying.
That's the argument. They say it can be this alternative way to participate in the global economy, They don't have to rely on traditional banks anymore. And they even give examples of governments using it for good stuff. Like in Estonia, they've got digital IDs and voting systems all built on blockchain.
So it's more secure, more transparent, and can even help people who are shut out of traditional financial systems.
Yeah.
That's a pretty powerful case.
Yeah, it's a strong start for sure. But now let's hear what the other side has to say. Let's get to the case against blockchain, the folks who think this whole thing is, a flawed promise.
Yeah, let's dig into that. What are they saying? Why do they think blockchain is not all it's cracked up to be?
Well, they basically come out swinging, right? They say that a lot of the promises of blockchain, they're just not realistic. And they see problems everywhere, morally, technologically, economically, you name it.
Okay, so let's break it down. Where do they see the biggest problems?
Well, one of their biggest issues is with the whole idea of decentralization. Blockchain is supposed to be this decentralized system, but they say that in reality, a lot of the power ends up concentrated in the hands of just a few, like the miners or big stakeholders who control the infrastructure. They argue that it's not truly decentralized, it's kind of a myth.
So they're saying it's centralized in disguise.
Exactly. And that undermines the whole point.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And what about their moral objections? You mentioned they had some.
Oh, yeah. They go hard on the environmental impact, especially how much energy some blockchains use. They keep bringing up the Cambridge Bitcoin Electricity Consumption Index, which basically says that Bitcoin mining uses more electricity than entire countries like Argentina.
Wow, that's a crazy amount of energy.
Yeah, and they say it's, a huge ethical problem, especially with climate change and everything. And their moral arguments don't stop there. They also talk about how blockchain can be used for illegal stuff crime.
Oh, right, because it's supposed to be anonymous.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and while some people say that anonymity is good for privacy, these folks say that criminals exploit it.
Yeah.
They bring up this report from Chainalysis that says something like $20 billion of illegal transactions happened on blockchain in 2022.
20 billion. That's a lot of bad stuff happening.
It's not good. So they're basically saying that blockchain makes it easier for criminals to do their thing and that it's a threat to public safety.
So we've got a battle of ideas here, right? The pro-blockchain side is saying it's going to revolutionize everything, make things safer, more transparent. And the other side is saying, hold on, it's not that simple. They're pointing out Real concerns about energy use, control, and even criminal activity.
Yeah, and it gets even more interesting because the pro-blockchain side doesn't just sit there and take it. They actually come back with some pretty strong counterarguments.
Okay, so how do they respond to all this? Like, how do they address the energy issue, for example?
Well, they say, first of all, that technology is always evolving, right? Blockchain isn't just stuck in the past. And they point to a big example, Ethereum. In 2022, they switched to something called a proof-of-stake system, which apparently uses way less energy. Like, they claim it cut energy use by 99.95%.
99.95%. That's almost all of it. If that's true, that's huge.
Yeah, it's a big deal. And they're basically saying, look, we're aware of the energy problem and we're working on solutions. They're not just ignoring it.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about the security concerns and the whole illegal activity thing? How do they answer that?
Well, their argument is that the security benefits of blockchain outweigh the risks. They talk a lot about how the blockchain ledger is immutable, which means it's super hard to change or tamper with. And they say that's a big advantage over traditional systems, like banking, where fraud is a big problem.
Right, because with blockchain, it's like once something's recorded, it's recorded forever. You can't just go back and change it.
Exactly. And about the illegal transactions, they point to tools like Elliptic, which are designed to track and analyze blockchain transactions. They say these tools can actually help fight money laundering and other crimes.
So they're not just saying, oh, it's anonymous, deal with it. They're saying we're building tools to make it more transparent and accountable.
Right. And they also point out that, criminals use cash for a lot of illegal stuff, too. They argue that blockchain might actually make things more transparent than they are now, which could help law enforcement.
Okay, so the pro-blockchain side is making some good points, I think. It sounds like they're acknowledging the challenges and trying to find solutions.
Yeah, they're definitely not shying away from the debate. But of course, the against side isn't just going to back down, right? They have some counter arguments of their own.
Right, of course. So what do they say about those solutions the pro-blockchain side is proposing? Like the proof-of-stake thing, for example.
Well, they say that, yeah, proof of stake uses less energy, but the problem is that the biggest blockchain, Bitcoin, still uses the old energy-intensive proof-of-work system. So they argue that the overall impact on the environment is still a major concern.
So it's like one step forward, two steps back kind of thing.
Yeah, kind of. And then they bring up another problem with the whole immutability thing. Like, yeah, it's great that you can't tamper with the blockchain, but what happens if there's a mistake?
Oh, right. Like if someone accidentally sends money to the wrong address or something.
Exactly. Or if there's a bug in a smart contract, which is basically a program that runs on blockchain. They point to this Harvard Business Review article that talks about how these irreversible errors can cause huge financial losses. They even bring up that incident from 2017 when a bug locked up $300 million worth of Ethereum.
300 million? That's a lot of money to lose just because of a bug. That's a scary thought.
Yeah, it definitely highlights the risks. And then the against side also makes a big point about consumer protection. They say that in the traditional financial world, there are rules and regulations to protect people, and you can usually get help if you're a victim of fraud or something. But with blockchain, because it's decentralized, there's often nobody to turn to.
So it's like buyer beware, basically.
Pretty much. They argue that this lack of consumer protection is a big vulnerability for people using blockchain.
Okay, so they're basically saying, sure, there might be solutions, but they're not perfect, and there are still a lot of risks.
It's a valid point, I think. Yeah, for sure. But of course, the pro-blockchain side isn't done yet. They have more to say, especially about those concerns with smart contracts and the environment.
Okay, so what's their next move? How do they address those issues?
Well, they talk about how people are working really hard to make smart contracts more secure. They mention things like formal verification, which is kind of like using math to prove that a program is correct. And they talk about auditing, which is basically having experts carefully check the code for any problems. They even give examples of platforms like IBM's Hyperledger Fabric and Cardano's Plutus, which they say are designed with security in mind.
So they're saying, hey, we're not just throwing these smart contracts out there without thinking about the risks.
Exactly. And about the environment, they keep stressing that blockchain is not a one-size-fits-all thing. They point to platforms like Algorand, which they say are actually carbon negative.
Carbon negative. Wait, so they're actually helping the environment?
That's what they claim. And it shows that there are different approaches to blockchain, and some of them might be much more sustainable than others.
Okay, that's really interesting. It seems like they're trying to show that there are solutions to these problems and that blockchain is more diverse than people might think.
Yeah, and they don't stop there. They also want to talk about how blockchain can be used for more than just finance.
Oh, right, because a lot of the debate so far has been about things like cryptocurrency and banking,
Hmm.
but there's more to it than that, right?
Yeah. They talk about healthcare, for example. They mention how Stanford Medicine is looking at using blockchain to share patient data securely and privately. And they talk about supply chains, how blockchain can make them more transparent and efficient, going beyond just preventing fraud.
So they're basically saying, look, this technology has the potential to improve all kinds of things, not just the financial system.
Yeah, and they even get into cybersecurity. They argue that decentralized storage, which is a key feature of many blockchains, can actually make data more secure because there's no single point of failure that hackers can target. They say it's much harder to hack a decentralized system than a centralized one.
Okay, so they've presented a lot of evidence to show that blockchain is evolving, that there are solutions to some of the problems, and that it has applications far beyond just finance. Pretty compelling stuff, I think.
Yeah, it's a strong response, but, the against side always has something to say, right? They have a further response to these
Of
points.
course. So what do they say now?
Well, they're still not convinced about the whole scalability thing. Like, can blockchain really handle, millions or even billions of transactions if everyone starts using it? They bring up a warning from the Bank of International Settlements, which is basically a group of central banks from around the world. They say that blockchain just isn't efficient enough to be used on a large scale.
So they're saying it's like, it works fine for small-scale stuff, but it'll break down if everyone tries to use it at the same time.
Exactly. And they use this example that really illustrates the point. They compare Visa, the credit card company, to Bitcoin. Visa can handle something like 65,000 transactions per second. Bitcoin, only about 7.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
Yeah, it's massive. And they argue that this is a fundamental problem with blockchain, that it just can't keep up with the demands of the global system. And then they address the whole environmentally friendly blockchain thing. They say, yeah, some blockchains might be carbon negative, but they're so small compared to the big ones that it doesn't really make a difference overall.
So they're saying it's like a drop in the bucket compared to the energy use of, like, Bitcoin.
Pretty much. They argue that the environmental impact is still a major concern, even with these alternative blockchains.
Good. So it sounds like we've got a real clash of perspectives here.
No.
Both sides are making valid points, and it's not clear-cut who's right or wrong.
Exactly. It's a complex issue with a lot of nuances. But I think it's helpful to try and break it down a bit further. Like, let's focus on the moral arguments for a moment. What are the key ethical claims being made on both sides?
Yeah, that's a good idea. So from the pro-blockchain side, what are their main moral arguments? Why do they think it's a good thing ethically?
Well, they talk a lot about trust. They say that because blockchain is transparent and tamper-proof, it can actually restore trust in systems that people have lost faith in. Like, if you know that a record is on the blockchain, you can be pretty sure that it's accurate and hasn't been messed with.
So it's like trust built into the technology itself.
Right. And then they talk about empowerment, how blockchain can give individuals more control over their own data and digital identities. They use the term self-sovereign identity, or SSI, which is basically the idea that you should own and control your own personal data, and blockchain can help you do that.
That makes sense. Instead of like big companies or governments controlling all your data, you have more power over it.
Exactly. And they also argue that blockchain can help fight corruption, like, for example, by creating immutable records of things like land ownership. If it's on the blockchain, it's much harder for corrupt officials to tamper with it.
Right, because it's all out in the open and everyone can see it.
Yeah. And finally, they talk about environmental accountability, how blockchain can be used to track things like carbon emissions and make sure that companies are actually doing what they say they're doing to protect the environment.
So they're basically saying that blockchain can be a force for good in the world, that it can help create a more just and sustainable society. Pretty big claims.
Yeah, definitely. But now let's hear the other side of the story. What are the key moral arguments from the anti-blockchain perspective? What are their ethical concerns?
Yeah, let's get into that. Why do they think blockchain is a bad thing ethically?
Well, they talk about the potential for illicit activities, like we mentioned before. The fact that blockchain can provide anonymity, they say, makes it easier for criminals to hide their activities and move money around without being traced.
So it's like the same features that make it secure and private for some people can also make it a haven for criminals.
Exactly. And then they bring up inequality. They argue that blockchain, especially cryptocurrencies, can actually worsen existing inequalities because they often reward early adopters who have the resources to invest early on. It creates a kind of winner-takes-all dynamic that can leave a lot of people behind.
So they're saying it could create a bigger gap between the rich and the poor.
Yeah, that's the concern. And of course, they keep hammering on the environmental cost, especially the energy use of proof-of-work blockchains. They see that as a major ethical problem given the urgency of climate change. And they also talk about accountability. Because blockchain is immutable, they argue, it can actually make it harder to hold people accountable for their actions. Like, if there's a mistake in a smart contract, there's often no way to fix it or to get compensation for any losses. They say that undermines the whole idea of justice and fairness.
So it's like the permanence of the blockchain can actually work against justice in some cases.
Right. And finally, they argue that blockchain can erode trust in established institutions, like governments and banks, without providing any better alternatives. They say it creates a kind of Wild West where there are no rules or regulations and where people are vulnerable to scams and exploitation.
Okay, so some pretty serious moral concerns there. Not all sunshine and roses, that's for sure.
Definitely not. And I think these contrasting moral viewpoints really highlight the complexity of the issue. It's not a simple black and white situation. There are legitimate concerns on both sides.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to acknowledge both sides of the argument and to have these discussions openly and honestly.
I agree. And it's not just about the moral arguments, right? We also need to look at the technological and economic aspects of blockchain and how those play into the overall debate.
Yeah, for sure. So let's try to summarize the key technological arguments that have been presented. What are the main points of disagreement on the technical side of things?
Well, the pro-blockchain side, they really emphasize the security aspect. They talk about how cryptography and decentralization make blockchain incredibly secure, much more so than traditional systems. They argue that the immutability of the blockchain makes it virtually impossible to tamper with data, which is a huge advantage when it comes to things like preventing fraud and ensuring data integrity.
So it's like a digital fortress, basically.
Yeah, that's kind of the idea. And they also talk a lot about smart contracts and how they can automate agreements and processes, making things more efficient and transparent. They see that as a major technological advancement with lots of potential applications.
So smart contracts are like digital agreements that enforce themselves automatically.
Exactly. And then they talk about scalability, acknowledging that it's been a challenge in the past, but arguing that there are new solutions being developed, like layer 2 solutions and sharding, that can help blockchain handle more transactions and scale up to meet the demands of wider adoption.
They're basically saying, we know there have been some technical hurdles, but we're working on overcoming them.
Right. And they also stress the open source nature of blockchain, how it fosters innovation and collaboration, because anyone can contribute to the development of the technology. I see that as a big plus, a way to drive progress and create a more decentralized and democratic tech landscape.
Okay, so they've made some strong points about security, innovation, and the potential of blockchain to really change how we do things.
Yeah, they've laid out a pretty compelling vision of the future. But now let's see what the anti-blockchain side has to say about all this. What are their main technological counter-arguments?
Yeah, because they clearly don't agree with this rosy picture of the future, right?
Right. They start by attacking the whole efficiency thing. They argue that blockchain transactions are just inherently slow and inefficient compared to traditional systems. They bring up that comparison we talked about before, Visa versus Bitcoin, to illustrate the point. And they argue that this lack of efficiency is a major obstacle to widespread adoption.
So even if they can solve the scalability problem, it's still going to be slower and more cumbersome than what we're used to.
That's their argument. And then they take aim at the security claims. They acknowledge that the blockchain itself might be secure, but they point out that the broader ecosystem around it is often vulnerable to attacks. They talk about things like exchanges being hacked or people losing their private keys, which are basically the passwords to their crypto wallets. So they're saying that the whole system is only as strong as its weakest link, and there are a lot of weak links out there.
Right, because it doesn't matter how secure the blockchain is if people could just steal your crypto by hacking an exchange or something.
Exactly. And then they revisit the scalability issue, arguing that it's not just a temporary hurdle, but a fundamental limitation of blockchain. They say that the solutions being proposed, like sharding, involve trade-offs that compromise other aspects of the technology, like decentralization or security. So they're basically saying you can't have it all.
So you have to choose between speed, security, and decentralization.
That's what they're suggesting. And they also point out that the immutability of blockchain can be a double-edged sword. Like, yeah, it prevents tampering, but it also means that mistakes can be permanent and irreversible. They argue that this lack of flexibility is a major drawback, especially when dealing with complex systems where things can go wrong.
Yeah, it makes sense. Like in the real world, we need the ability to correct errors and make changes as needed. If everything is set in stone, that can be a problem.
Right. And finally, they make the point that blockchain is often overkill, that it's a complex solution being applied to problems that could be solved with simpler and more efficient technologies. They argue that in many cases, blockchain is just not necessary and that it adds unnecessary complexity and cost.
So it's like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut.
Exactly. They're saying that sometimes there are better tools for the job.
Okay, so we've got a real battle of ideas here on the technological front as well. It's clear that there are both advantages and disadvantages to blockchain, and it's not a clear-cut win for either side.
For sure. It's a complex technology with a lot of potential, but also a lot of challenges. And I think it's important to understand both sides of the argument before making any judgments about its future.
Absolutely, and we can't forget about the economic side of things either. Blockchain has the potential to disrupt entire industries and change the way we think about money and value. So let's wrap up by summarizing the key economic arguments that have been presented on both sides.
Okay, so let's start with the pro-blockchain perspective. They argue that blockchain can make the economy more efficient by cutting out middlemen and reducing transaction costs. They point to the potential for peer-to-peer transactions where people can interact directly with each other without needing banks or other intermediaries.
So it's like cutting out the gatekeepers and democratizing access to financial services.
Exactly. And they also talk about financial inclusion, how blockchain can give people who are excluded from traditional banking systems access to financial services. They see that as a major benefit, especially in developing countries where many people don't have bank accounts.
Right, because if you can access financial services through your phone, you don't need a physical bank branch, right?
And then they talk about new economic opportunities, how blockchain can create new markets and business models. They point to things like NFTs, which are digital assets that are unique and can be traded on blockchain platforms. And they talk about tokenization, which is basically the process of representing real-world assets like stocks or real estate on a blockchain. They see this as a way to unlock liquidity and create new investment opportunities.
So they're basically saying that blockchain can make the economy more inclusive, efficient, and innovative. Pretty exciting stuff if it works out.
Yeah, it's a big vision.
Yeah.
But now let's hear what the anti-blockchain side has to say about the economics of all this.
Yeah, because they're not exactly known for their optimism, are they?
Well, they start by pointing out the volatility of cryptocurrencies, how the prices can fluctuate wildly, making them a risky investment. They argue that this instability makes blockchain-based economies unreliable and unpredictable.
Right, because if the value of your money can go up or down by like 20% in a day, that's not exactly a stable foundation for an economy.
Exactly. And then they talk about the costs, arguing that blockchain transactions can actually be quite expensive, especially compared to traditional systems. They point to things like transaction fees and the energy costs associated with mining.
So they're saying it's not as efficient as it claims to be.
Right. And then they raise the issue of exclusion. They argue that blockchain can actually create new barriers to entry, especially for people who are not tech savvy or who don't have access to the necessary technology. They say it could create a digital divide where only a privileged few can participate in the blockchain economy.
So it's like the opposite of financial inclusion.
Yeah, in a way. And they also worry about what they call economic drain. They argue that blockchain, especially cryptocurrencies, can divert capital away from productive investments and into speculative bubbles. They say it's like a casino where people are just gambling on the price of crypto going up, and that doesn't create real value for the economy.
So they're basically saying that it's a distraction from the real economy, a way for people to make quick money without actually contributing anything of value.
That's their concern. And finally, they talk about the regulatory chaos surrounding blockchain. They argue that the lack of clear regulations creates uncertainty and risk, making it difficult for businesses to operate and for investors to feel confident.
So it's like the Wild West all over again.
Kind of. They argue that this regulatory uncertainty could lead to financial instability and could even harm the broader economy.
Wow, so we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the moral, technological, and economic arguments both for and against blockchain. And it's clear that this is a technology that evokes strong opinions and passionate debate.
Definitely. It's a complex issue with a lot of nuances, and there are no easy answers. But I think it's been helpful to go through these arguments systematically and to see the different perspectives on the table.
Absolutely. It's important to be aware of both the potential benefits and the potential risks of blockchain before forming any opinions or making any decisions about its future.
I agree. And I think this deep dive has shown that blockchain is not a silver bullet, a solution to all our problems. It's a tool, a powerful one, but it's up to us to decide how we use it and whether we use it for good or for ill.
That's a great point. It's not the technology itself that's good or bad, it's how we choose to use it. And those choices are going to have a big impact on our future.
Exactly. And speaking of the future, I think there's one more thing we should consider, something that came up during this debate that I think is particularly thought-provoking. We talked a lot about immutability, the fact that once something is recorded on the blockchain, it's permanent and can't be changed. And while that can be a good thing in terms of security and preventing tampering, it also raises some interesting questions about, like, what happens if there's a mistake? What if someone is wrongly accused of something and that accusation is permanently recorded on the blockchain? Or what if a law is passed that is later deemed unjust or unfair, but it's already been encoded into a smart contract on the blockchain? Can we really have a just and equitable society if we're making decisions that are literally set in stone?
That's a really interesting question. It makes you think about the limits of technology and the importance of human judgment and the ability to adapt and change our minds.
Exactly. And it's something that we need to be thinking about carefully as we continue to develop and deploy blockchain technology. Because ultimately, it's not just about the technology itself, it's about the kind of world we want to create.
Well said. I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks for this fascinating discussion.
My pleasure. It's been a great deep dive.